right, let's get right into it. For years, the #1 piece of advice against ransomware was pretty simple, right? Have good backups. If you get hit, don't pay the criminals, just restore your systems and move on. But what if that entire playbook is now dangerously out of date? We're going to break down how the ransomware game has completely changed and why your backups might not be the silver bullet you think they are. So, to kick things off, let's ask a question that honestly sounds a little bit optimistic. Are we actually starting to win the fight against ransomware? Because, if you just glance at some of the recent numbers, you might actually be tempted to say, yeah. And what's really turning heads is this number. According to the latest data, a massive 86% of organizations that get hit with ransomware are now refusing to pay up. I mean, that's a huge shift. It's a powerful signal that companies are finally standing their ground. But here's the twist. That success, that new backbone, it hasn't made the problem just disappear. Oh no. Instead, it's forced the criminals to get smarter, way more vicious, and to change their entire strategy. The fight hasn't ended, it's just entered a brand new and honestly more dangerous phase. So first, let's really unpack that good news because it reveals this really strange contradiction at the heart of cybersecurity right now. Let's dig into the data. And right away, this creates a real puzzle. On one hand, the average initial ransom demand has just skyrocketed, up 47%, now topping over $1 million. But at the same time, the average actual loss for a company has dropped by 19%. So how can both of those things possibly be true? Well, it really comes down to three things. First, like we said, organizations are just getting way better at restoring from their backups. Second, that incredible 86% refusal rate means a lot less money is flowing to the criminals. And third, even for the small 14% who do end up paying, professional negotiators are coming in and slashing those initial demands by an average of 65%. So on the surface, this all looks like a major win for the good guys. But criminals adapt. They saw this trend, and they realized their old business model was starting to fail. So they changed the terms of the deal. Their thinking shifted to, okay, if you won't pay to get your systems back online, you'll pay to stop your most sensitive data from being leaked to the entire world. And this is the new threat we're all facing. It's called dual extortion, and it's a nasty 1-2 punch. Yeah, they still lock up your files, but before they do that, they quietly sneak in, copy, and steal your most valuable data. Suddenly, your backups are kind of irrelevant. Sure, you can restore your systems, but they still have your secrets. And now the threat is to expose everything. And this tactic hasn't just appeared, it has become incredibly dominant. A full 70%, 70, of all ransomware incidents now involve this dual extortion method. Those old-school, encryption-only attacks that a good backup could defeat, they now make up just a tiny fraction of what's going on out there. And it's not just more common, it's also way more expensive. The average loss from a dual extortion attack is more than double that of an old-school encryption-only attack. The data here is crystal clear. When criminals steal your data, the financial and reputational damage goes through the roof. So, if the old playbook doesn't work anymore, what does the new one look like? How do you actually defend against an enemy who couldn't care less about your backups? Let's break down the modern defensive strategy. I think we should start with this fantastic quote from Shelley Ma, who's an incident response lead. The message here is that backups are still absolutely crucial, but we have to start treating them like a last line of defense fortress, not just some copy of your files. They have to be isolated, protected, and tested like crazy. Okay, so this all breaks down into 3 core steps. First, you gotta harden and isolate those backups. Keep them totally separate from your main network with their own credentials. Second, test them all the time. A backup you haven't tested is basically just a hope and a prayer. But third, and this is the real game changer, is data governance. Put simply, that just means knowing what data you have, why you have it, and actively getting rid of sensitive information you don't need anymore. And this really gets to the heart of the new strategy. Think of all your sensitive data as ammunition for an attacker. If you proactively disarm your own systems by minimizing that data, the attacker's main weapon is just neutralized. They might break in, but their leverage to extort you is gone. You can't leak data that isn't there in the first place. Okay, so that's the strategy, but to really make it work, you have to know where to focus your defenses. So let's look at how these attackers are actually getting in the front door. And the data reveals a shockingly dominant entry point. A staggering 59% of ransomware incidents start with vulnerabilities in virtual private networks. You know, the very tools companies use to provide secure remote access. Remote desktop applications are a distant second. If you have these tools facing the internet, they are by far your biggest weak spots. So how are they exploiting those weak spots? Well, it's mainly two methods. Number one is software exploits. Attackers using automated tools that just constantly scan the internet for unpatched, vulnerable systems. And number two is good old-fashioned compromised credentials. You know, stolen or weak passwords. Seriously, patching your systems and using strong authentication, it is absolutely critical. Okay, finally, let's just zoom out for a second. Because as devastating as ransomware is, it's really important to understand where it fits into the overall threat landscape that companies are dealing with today. If you look at the frequency of cyber insurance claims, ransomware actually comes in third, at about 21%. The two most common threats are actually business email compromise, so phishing attacks, and funds transfer fraud, where criminals trick employees into wiring money. They might not get the same crazy headlines, but they are happening even more often. So if there's one thing you should take away from all this, it's this. The entire battlefield has shifted. The fight against ransomware is no longer just about preventing business disruption. Thanks to this dual extortion tactic, it's now a battle to protect your company's reputation and your customers' private data. Which leaves us with one final critical question for you to really think about. You've probably spent years making sure your systems can be restored from a backup. And that's great. But have you spent enough time making sure your most sensitive data is safe from being stolen and released to the world? Because that is the question that truly defines cybersecurity today.